What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical, average American here today to react and learn about every country that Britain has ever invaded. As an American, I don't know too much about British history other than the British Empire was really big. So I assume that it must have done a lot of invading. So today, I want to know exactly how much invading the British Empire did, and so I want to take a look at this video, every country that Britain has ever invaded. Let's take a look.
I'm going to do my best at attempting to visualize all of Britain's invasions and conquests for you, continent by continent, in as brief a time as possible.
Okay.
So let's begin with the closest continent to Britain.
Oh my god, continent by continent. This video is not that short either. How many countries has Britain invaded? Britain! Oh my god, okay.
Europe. Ireland was the first target of British conquests and was invaded as early as 1169.
Wow.
Within 400 years of gradual conquests, the entire island was ruled by the British and
wow, at one point all of Ireland was part of Britain? Because I know now it's like Ireland is separate. There's Northern Ireland, and it's separated, and that's part of the UK, not Britain, and all this weird stuff. And the other thing is, back in 1169, Britain has been doing this for almost 1,000 years. Holy cow! Such a long history.
Remained that way until most of it was granted independence in 1921. Historically, France has probably been invaded by the English more times than any other country in the world.
France! Poor France! What? Britain has invaded and re-invaded the same country multiple times? And poor France has the honor of being invaded the most. Oh, France!
Let's take a look at this huge list of invasions. There's not even enough time to talk about a third of these. And
what? There's like 20. Britain has technically invaded France like 20 times? Oh my god.
For a time, all of this territory inside of modern France was directly controlled by the English, with Calais being the final piece that fell in 1557. Well, except for that time when the British took over Corsica for a couple years.
What?
The British continue to invade Spain by the millions every winter. But in the past, they've come with a lot less friendly intentions. English and later British soldiers invaded under the Black Prince in 1366.
It's insane to me. Like, it's amazing in a way, impressive in a way, like how Britain managed to extend its reach so far away from its like home territory, you know, like really, really far away from where Britain actually is.
And continued on through the first, second, third, and fourth raids on Cadiz and that time when the British took over Gibraltar and Minorca. They gave Minorca back, but decided on keeping Gibraltar forever. In recent history, the British have invaded Belgium in order to support the Belgians.
Belgium?
But that wasn't always the case. They conducted two pretty large-scale invasions of modern-day Belgium in 1654 and again in 1701.
And now we've gone from the 1100s to the 1700s. Such a long span of history where Britain was just like, hey, Belgium, I like Belgium. Let's go get that. That's just how it was.
And Flanders itself was ruled by the English for a few years in the 14th century. The Netherlands was one of England's historical arch rivals, and so there's been plenty of invasions going in this direction across the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1940, the British technically invaded and took over Iceland peacefully for a year.
Iceland? This is making me spit a little bit. I'm in such shock. Iceland? But peacefully invaded Iceland, whatever that means. I had no idea what Britain has been up to. I'm realizing that. Do British people learn about all of this during like British history class? Like all of these invasions? Holy, this is so much.
In order to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Germans. But this was heavily protested by the Icelandic government at the time, so in my books, it still counts as an invasion. Italy, of course, was...
Britain invaded Iceland to try to help protect it, but Iceland didn't really want that. And Britain was just like, it's good for you that we're invading. Okay, let's keep going. We're in Italy now, because why not?
Was invaded by the British Army during the Second World War as well in 1943. But there were plenty of invasions before then, dating back to Richard the Lionheart's invasion in 1190.
How?
Germany, too, was obviously invaded by the British Army in 1945, and northwestern Germany was occupied by the British for 3 years until 1948.
Okay.
But a lot of German territory was ruled by Britain long before then. The islands of
Really?
Heligoland were British for most of the 19th century.
Heligoland? I've never even heard of Heligoland. Now, Britain is invading places I've never even heard of. I never even knew about.
And the Kingdom of Hanover was effectively ruled under a personal union for over a century between 1714 and 1837.
Okay.
Austria was also invaded in 1945, and the southwest of the country was occupied for a decade.
Austria? How is Britain doing this? Like, it's so far from Britain. And we are not even close to done with this video either. And we've already named like 6 different countries.
Norway was invaded in 1810 and 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars when it was a part of Denmark-Norway because Denmark was aligned to France, so obviously Denmark was invaded during that time as well.
What?
Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were all briefly invaded by small units during the Crimean War against Russia because they were all part of the Russian Empire at the time.
What?
And of course, Russia itself was invaded then too, as well as in 1918
Okay.
when the British took over a large chunk of northern Russia for a time in their fight against the Bolsheviks.
Really? I didn't even know about that. This is like more modern history, just like 100 years ago or so. I don't know anything about this stuff either, I have to admit.
The territory of modern Ukraine was invaded by British Army units during the Crimean War. The British took over the Croatian island of Vis between 1807 and 1814 during their fight against Napoleon. The British Army had boots and guns on the ground in Bosnia recently between 1992 and 95, fighting against the Bosnian Serbs.
Okay.
And around the same time, the RAF also carried out bombing strikes against Serbian Serb targets in Serbia in 1999.
Really? I mean, there's so much stuff here. But I guess what makes sense the most is that this has happened over the span of like 1,000 years, all these separate invasions. I don't know, at this point it almost seems like it'd be easier to just list the places that Britain has not invaded. That would be quicker.
Montenegro was briefly blockaded and invaded in 1913 during the First Balkan War. The British owned the westernmost Ionian islands of Greece between 1815 and 1863 before they gave them back, while Bulgaria was invaded and almost entirely occupied by the British Army between 1918 and 1919 at the
Bulgaria?
end of World War I.
Bulgaria?
Cyprus was a British protectorate between 1878 and 1914 when they decided to just outright annex it to piss off the Turks, and it remained annexed until 1960, except for
Really?
2 small chunks that are still British today. Turkey itself
And that's the other thing. That's a really interesting thing that I know a little bit about. There's like parts of the British Empire that still kind of exist in parts of the world to this day. Like, I think as far as British reach goes, like it went all the way to Australia, like Canada. Now I see Bulgaria even to this day, it sounds like.
was massively invaded by the British during World War I, and part of it was occupied between 1919 and 1923. That wraps up
Okay.
Europe, so let's move on to Asia next.
Ooh, okay. Oh my. That's just Europe. That's just Europe. Okay, we're moving on to a different continent now. That's how we're doing this. Okay. Asia. I had no idea Britain was ever even like in Asia. So this is going to be very interesting to me.
Modern-day Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan, were British-controlled from the end of World War I to 1948 and 1946, respectively. Lebanon
Really?
and Syria were both occupied from the Vichy French government briefly during World War II. Iraq was ruled between 1919 and 1932 and
What?
invaded again during the Second World War, and again in 1991, and again in 2003. Kuwait was a colony.
Some of this stuff is so recent as well. I'm kind of like shocked I've never even heard of a lot of this. A lot of this is pretty modern, actually.
For over 60 years until 1966, Georgia and Azerbaijan were both invaded and occupied right at the end of World War I for a year. Iran has been invaded at least 3 times, with the most notable example being the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941. Turkmenistan was invaded.
So just to be clear, this is British invasions. It doesn't necessarily mean Britain controlled the entire country or their government or had like power over them. This is counting even every single time Britain ever attempted to invade or put like soldiers on the ground in another country. I'm guessing that's the only explanation for this, for how many there are.
In 1918 to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading any further. Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot since it's been invaded in 1839, 1878, 1919, and again in 2001. Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman were all controlled by the British until the early 1970s, while a chunk of Yemen...
No, actually, a lot of these were actually straight up controlled by Britain for a while. Oh my gosh, this is insane. Like, I knew this video was going to be interesting, but I really had no concept of just how many times Britain invaded other countries. This is almost absurd. But I can't look away at the same time.
Yemen was controlled for over a century between 1839 and 1967. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were all, of course, invaded many times and outright ruled by the British Empire in parts for nearly 2 centuries between 1757 and 1947.
What? I never knew this. When? What? For 200 years? Britain conquered them? Like, what? I never heard about this.
Nepal was invaded in 1814, but never successfully conquered. Bhutan was invaded in 1772 and again in 1864, and was sort of conquered as a protectorate between 1910 and 1948. Burma/Myanmar was
this is not a short amount of time either that this stuff is happening.
Invaded in 1826 and was definitely successfully conquered and ruled through 1947. Thailand was briefly invaded in 1945 since they were allied to Japan in World War II, and so was Vietnam in the same year, but that was to support the French government against the growing independence movement.
I mean, we're really getting to the point where this is nowhere even remotely close to where Britain is actually geographically located. We're all the way in Malaysia at this point. I had no idea.
Malaysia and Singapore were each conquered and ruled up until the 1950s and 1960s. Brunei was conquered and ruled up until the 1980s, whereas the Philippines were briefly invaded during the 7 Years' War. China got invaded a lot, and Hong Kong was a colony until as recently as 1997. And while not outright...
Hong Kong was a British colony? This is honestly fascinating and also kind of eye-opening to how little I know about British history. Like, the vast majority of this stuff I have never heard before. And I would think I would have known, like, that Britain at some point was, like, had Hong Kong as a colony and was in Bangladesh and all this stuff.
Invaded, part of Japan was occupied following World War II between 1946 and 1952. And finally, Indonesia was invaded a bunch during the Napoleonic Wars since it was a Dutch colony aligned to France at the time. Next up, Oceania. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were invaded by the British and established as colonies that each gained independence in 1931.
Of course, I love how the narrator is like, of course. You all remember the time that Papua New Guinea was owned by the British Empire, and it's like, no, I didn't hear about that.
Papua New Guinea was also a British colony for a time, as were the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move.
It's crazy to me, the idea how Australia, so far away from Britain, was like a part of the British Empire and that there were British colonies all the way down here by Australia. That's amazing. I don't know how Britain did all this. Like, literally, how?
As were the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move back over to Africa next, which the British have violently visited a lot.
Africa? The British were in Africa? Like, what?
In terms of just places the British outright colonized after invasions, there's the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, along with parts of modern-day Somalia and Guinea. Senegal.
What? What? I honestly am, like, I'm numb. I'm numb at this point. I'm honestly just impressed. Like, how did Britain do this? Like, literally how?
Senegal was briefly invaded and had some of their coastline taken over in the 1700s, while during the Second World War, the British invaded the French colonies of Djibouti, Madagascar, and Comoros after they aligned themselves with the Nazi Vichy regime, and the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, although they had also invaded Ethiopia much earlier in 1868. And as German colonies right before...
I didn't know Britain was, like, ever in Africa? That's not even scratching the surface. Britain, like, conquered half of Africa, apparently. Or I'm not exactly sure how deep these conflicts went, or if this was just, like, attempted invasions or what, but this is still pretty crazy for me to learn.
Before World War I, the British also invaded Togo and Cameroon without annexing them afterwards. For the final area of the world left to discuss, let's move over to the Americas. All of Canada was a British colony until 1931, while Newfoundland remained until 1949. The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776.
There we go. Finally. Something that I'm familiar with. Okay. Finally, my comfort zone.
And was invaded.
I've never been so happy to to hear that Britain owned something before.
Again, in 1812, and the modern states of Oregon and Washington were claimed right up until 1846. As far as other outright British colonies here go, there was the Bahamas, Jamaica, Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Besides colonies, Cuba was invaded and occupied during the 7 Years' War in 1762.
Do Brits know Britain invaded all these places? Like, this is when it becomes difficult to keep track of all the places you've invaded. That I don't know what that says. This was obviously like the biggest empire ever.
Haiti was invaded in 1793 during the French Revolutionary Wars. The Dominican Republic was invaded way back in 1655 in an attempt at conquest under Oliver Cromwell. Parts of the east coast of Honduras and Nicaragua were conquered and ruled for nearly 2 centuries until 1819. They sent the Navy to invade Mexico in 1861 to force them to repay some debts, and during the splendidly named War of Jenkins Year, aka the more lame-sounding War of the Austrian Succession, the British invaded a lot of Spain's colonies, including Panama.
What? Britain literally tried to conquer the world. Like, that sounds like an exaggeration, like a joke. It's not. Like, after this video, I'm convinced. Britain tried to take over the world, the planet.
A huge one into Colombia, and ultimately Peru. In 1796, the British took over Suriname because it was a Dutch colony, and they were allied with the revolutionary French and later Napoleon. They also invaded Martinique and Guadeloupe because they actually were French during the Napoleonic Wars. Venezuela was invaded in 1902 as...
By the way, we're in South America at this point. Like, what? I didn't know Britain was ever in Asia, Africa, South America. No idea.
Part of the so-called Venezuela crisis to force the country to repay some debts they had defaulted on, kind of like Mexico, while Argentina and Uruguay were both invaded during the Napoleonic Wars as well in 1806 when Spain and her colonies were still allied with Napoleon. And that pretty much sums up all of the territory the British have ever ruled and all of the countries this small island has ever invaded.
Oh my god, thank goodness. Oh my goodness. We're at the end. Oh my gosh. I mean, there's nowhere else to go. I'm shocked we're not heading to Antarctica or the North Pole to talk about Britain's invasions. Wow, I'm kind of stunned. Let's keep going here and finish this out.
There are a total of 65 countries today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire.
65. I thought, like us Americans, we were kind of like unique we celebrate our independence. We have Independence Day. We're not special. We're just one of many British colonies or whatever that celebrate our independence from Britain. We're one of like 60. What?
The empire used to rule over a quarter of all the world's land at the same time and was the biggest empire in human history. And in total, today, there have been 117 modern countries that have been aggressively invaded by the British Armed Forces during some point in their histories.
I don't get it. Like, Britain, what is your secret? Not that I want to invade a quarter of the world, as far as you know. But what is the secret? Like, Britain is on something. Britain's onto something. Like, people died and there was, like, horrible war and conflict, and that's all terrible. But putting that aside for a moment, this is just, like, impressive. Like, unbelievable. I had no idea this was a thing. That Britain had invaded, attempted to invade, partially owned, like, a quarter of the planet at one point. This is new information to me, and I don't know what to think.
Representing a total of 60% of all the world's nations, which is almost the same number of countries that you can watch this video in. YouTube is available in 100...
Okay, I think that's the end there. Oh my god. That's all I can say. Oh my god. I need I feel like I need to stop this. Like something like this is all happening like right now or something. Since I'm just learning about it, I'm like, I gotta go tell someone. We gotta stop the British. And it's like, no, this happened like hundreds of years ago. Some of this stuff happened like very recently, like 20 years ago, 10 years ago, or some of these things. Most of this was hundreds, if not 1,000 years ago. But that doesn't change anything. That doesn't change the fact that this is outrageous. This was, since this basically is learning about history, this was fun to learn about. I am just genuinely shocked. This video was by Real Life Lore, and I gotta give that a like, because that was a very nice way of, like, showing and going step by step through all the countries Britain has invaded. I just didn't know it was going to be this much. That's ridiculous. I am going to be thinking about this for a while now. I am a changed man. Britain, please don't get mad at the world anytime soon, or it's obvious at any point you can just conquer a quarter of it. That's ridiculous. That was really fun to learn about, actually. I enjoyed this, and I'm a bit terrified. Anyway, if you enjoyed this as well, feel free to give this video a like, or leave a comment with your thoughts on this video, every country that Britain has ever invaded. And if you're interested in more videos like this, me reacting to Britain and British culture and stuff about Britain I've never learned before, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.